There are a lot of videos on YouTube with Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate in physics, and he's a brilliant, very interesting fellow. And in one of them he says that I think that understanding the physical properties of a phenomena do not detract from its beauty, but they enhance it. And I think that that's certainly can be true, but perhaps with certain phenomena it's more true than with others, and perhaps with certain individuals. But I think the former is more relevant. There's also a Feynman conversation in which he develops a method for detecting the passage of time in his head, where he counts out internally the seconds and is able to perform a lot of visual tasks, but is unable to hold a conversation because it interferes with his ability to count. And he tells a physicist, well, a friend of his, I think it's impossible to do it if you're holding a conversation. And the physicist says, I can do it. Just let me practice a little bit and I'll do it. And he did it. And Feynman said, how did you do that? And what the guy had done is he had, instead of verbalizing the passage of time, he had created in his mind a clock, a digital clock, and he saw the digits count, and he was able to do it. And this leads to an interesting phenomena, the idea that essentially scientists believe that because the human birth canal is fairly narrow, that the brain had to make certain compromises. And as a result of those compromises, parts of our brains, specifically the verbal parts, talk so much that they interfere with other parts. And of course, this is, in essence, the basis of meditation. To shut off the verbal part of the mind so that other parts can have a chance to become active, so that you can have that experience. Now, what scientists have found is that in certain individuals who have had a stroke in the verbal parts of the brain, their ability to draw is vastly increased. And I've seen pictures of this. I mean vastly. It's quite phenomenal. And they've been able to reproduce the phenomena by something called transcranial stimulation, which is where they use a magnetic field to interfere with the verbal part of the brain. And people are able to, while under this influence, they can't talk, but they can draw far better than they ever could. And the implication is, oh, when you shut it off, they can't draw anymore. So it's not a permanent thing, because the verbal mind, we believe, starts chattering again and interfering with the visual. Now, of course, there's a lot of other parts to our minds, one would hope, than just these. But it occurs to me that if you're looking at a sunset, and you know something about the process of fusion, in which the energy is generated in the sun, and you know something about the dispersion of light, the refraction and the reflection off dust particles and so forth of light, that it's relatively easy to let all that go and just enjoy the sunset. That's not a very verbal, conceptual thing. Not conceptual in a certain way. It may be scientifically and analytically conceptual, but there are other concepts dealing with emotions and humanities, aspects of humanity, that I think get interfered with when they're discussed a little bit more. Think of as an example, what happens in a story. If you think about it like a novel, like Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles. Well, what happens is that's not about vampires, really. It's about what it is to be human. It's about persecution. It's about isolation. It's about the quest for power. It's about fear. It's about sexuality. But it's put in a context where it's not explicit. In other words, these are metaphors, and by getting away from the real world in ways that you cannot do in a novel in the real world, even if it's fiction, it has more power. And it's not because you can just stretch what is possible. exaggerate the nature of a vampire, but that is of course part of it. But it's also because by leaving our world, our rules, you create a separation in the mind. And I think this happens in mythology as well. Except there's a difference. Because in mythology, you can actually be living within the myth. In the Anne Rice books, I would be reading the books and then I would leave them and enter the real world again. And I quite really felt that I was entering her world and then coming out of it. But if you're living within a mythology, as we all are to some degree, but some cultures more than others, you're immersed in it in a more permanent way. Movie directors, when interviewed, quite a few of them, when asked, are you able to just enjoy a movie, sit back and watch a movie and enjoy it? Say no. Since I became a director, I'm unable to. There's too much chatter in my brain. I can't help it. I can't stop the analysis, the directorial critique. I've lost that ability. Now, they feel like they've gained something, but they've also lost something. Joseph Campbell, comparative mythologist, was asked about mythology by Bill Moyers in the interview with Bill Moyers. He was asked, are you able to participate in mythology? And of course, Moyers is religious and Campbell is an atheist. And Moyers is trying to see if Campbell can still at least participate in just mythology, not necessarily religion. And Campbell said, no, I can't. I've analyzed mythology for too long to be able to participate in it, to become a part of it. And I thought about a magic trick. You know, a magic trick can be a miracle. I mean, it can literally be beyond our physical world. I mean, I guess you wouldn't call it a magic trick, you'd call it a miracle. But it has, pardon me, a sort of magic, doesn't it? When you don't know how it works. And of course, a magic trick can be a magic trick. You could know it's of our world, but you don't know how it's done. But then when you do know how it's done, there's a change. You've gained in knowledge. You might appreciate the artistry of the magician, but there's something lost. And that what's lost is probably on a more trivial level than what I'm getting at. But I believe that what happens, and I believe this happens with mythology and with religions, is that religions, the mythological aspect of religions and mythology in general, is essentially a very conceptual, verbal process, phenomena. It informs people on a deeper level. It gets beneath the verbal and it hits you in the unconscious, and then it bubbles up to the conscious. And it's far more effective in creating certain types of thoughts and understandings, of interrelationships. That's what the arts do. But because of its very nature of being essentially verbal and symbolic, which is handled by that verbal part of the mind, I believe that it's susceptible to a far greater degree than a sunset to this process of interference. Now, please understand, this is not something I've read. I've basically been telling you things up to now, which I have read, and this is my... I knocked over my flower and shut down the video all at the same time. I don't like to edit these. But what I was saying just a moment ago was that at this point, this is speculative. This is my speculation. And what I'm sort of getting at is that if I were reading Anne Rice and analyzing it from our world, it would evaporate. Its power would be lost. Largely lost. And I believe the same is true for certain stories. When you analyze them, it's impossible for us, our brains, to separate the two. So unlike a sunset, if we analyze it sufficiently, we gain something and we lose something. And I believe that when folks that are religious, and I'm looking at religion as a mythology, there's much more to it than just that, but that's how I'm looking at it here. When they are adverse to rational analysis, and the types of things that atheists typically do, I think that to some extent there is an understanding, and it may not be conscious, that if they go down that route, that something will be destroyed. And certainly they can fight back by making arguments, but those arguments are going to remain within their mythology. So that this idea of faith is really possibly a way, I mean, I guess I believe it, but I don't want to be too bold here because I'm not a man of science. Perhaps I am. But I think it's their way of avoiding intuitively the destruction of what they feel is an important part of their life. And I don't have a suggestion about like, oh, is there another approach? I certainly think that this implies that there are other approaches. I haven't thought to discussing these issues with someone that is religious. But I think that these constellation of ideas, which perhaps I'll pick up on in another video, are interesting stuff. So I don't really have a way to wrap it up, yeah, wait a second, I do.